The text I get asked about the most is the flood narrative, Genesis chapters 6 through 9. Not only does God wipe out all of humanity except for Noah and his family, but beforehand he curiously expresses regret over creating humans. In addition to working through these problems related to Noah's story, I will conclude by pointing out how God's covenant with Noah has profound implications for a Christian perspective on caring for God's creation. In conclusion, I want to share one of my favorite stories about someone I offended along the way. The book's title, God Behaving Badly, was an attempt to take the problem of God's behavior in the Old Testament seriously, but responses varied widely. One of the endorsers, Allison Seward, appreciated it. Even the title of Dave Lamb's book gave me hope. Others, however, didn't. I do not like Lamb's title. It is irreverent. It is disrespectful to God. Please change the title. These words were from Joseph, who, after reading an interview with me on my seminary's website, felt as if he needed to express his perspective on our Facebook page. While my initial response was indignant, I refrained. Here's how I replied. Thanks, Joseph, for your honesty, but the reality is that even if you don't think God behaves badly, a lot of people do after they read sections of the Old Testament, and so we need to talk about God's problematic behavior. His next response was more subdued, but he repeated the main points from his initial post. The title is irreverent, disrespectful. I again thanked him for engaging with me, but then added, You know, Joseph, the full title is actually a question. Is the God of the Old Testament angry, sexist, and racist? And Scripture is full of people who ask questions about God's behavior. For example, Abraham, Genesis chapter 18, verse 23. Moses, Exodus chapter 32, verse 11. The psalmist, Psalm 13, verse 1. And even Jesus on the cross questioned God's behavior. My God, why have you forsaken me? Mark chapter 15, verse 34, quoting from Psalm 22, verse 1. Our interaction was taking place on the evening of Good Friday. I concluded, if Jesus can question God's behavior, shouldn't it be okay for us to do so? The next day, I received a Facebook friend request from Joseph, which I quickly accepted. He sent a message. I still don't like the title, but I'll read the book. I was pleased. While Joseph and I may not totally agree, I gained a friend and a book sale. What impressed me the most about Joseph was his willingness to engage with me and to be open to new ideas, which will be important to us all as we attempt to make sense of a God who seems to behave badly. 1. A bad reputation. How does one reconcile the loving God of the Old Testament with the harsh God of the New Testament? When I ask this question of students, at first they are shocked, and then most assume that I have simply misspoken, as I am prone to do. They typically have heard the question inverted along these lines. How did the mean Old Testament God morph into a nice guy like Jesus? I assure them that this time, at least, I have not accidentally inverted my words. I then observe that God in the Old Testament is consistently described as slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, but Jesus speaks about hell more than anyone else in Scripture. The word hell doesn't even show up in English translations of the Old Testament. My question usually provokes a lively discussion. Eventually, I assure the class that I believe that the God of both the Old and New Testaments can be characterized by love. This book is my attempt to reconcile the supposedly contradictory portrayals of God in the two Testaments. But first, let me explain how I ended up teaching about the loving God.